All right, well, thank you for the invite. I'm gonna share my screen here, Kathy. Let's see if this works out here. I assume you can see my screen.
Yep, there we go.
All right, it's kind of brings me back to my COVID teaching days. So those in the back of the room, you should scoot up front. Just kidding you, but thanks for having me. Thanks for having me from far away. As you heard, my heart rests in the South. I'm a beach bum by nature, and I would love to be down there with you enjoying the sun. We had some nice days today, so I'll leave it with that. But today we're going to talk ticks. Um, and specifically, um, there's my animation right there. I got to show you my skills in PowerPoint, but we're going to talk ticks. And specifically tick-borne diseases and how you can prevent diseases for you and your loved ones. And then I tied in some data from Florida. We'll talk a little bit about that. There's not a lot out there, but I do have some experience in Florida, so I'll bring in some of that through the presentation as well. But we all know about Lyme disease. We've probably heard about it. This is the talk of the town. It's an epidemic. There's 500,000 people in the United States that gets Lyme disease each year. Unfortunately for up here in New York, it is very focal to the upper Northeast. And let me see if I remember how to do this correctly. The Northeast and the Midwest. However, it's important to note that these little blue dots are cases spread across the United States. So Lyme disease does happen everywhere. And there's other diseases we need to be concerned about, and I'll talk a little bit about them in this talk. Now, why do we care about Lyme disease? Well, it affects 500,000 people a year, and all the cool kids are getting it. Not a joke. Lyme disease is not a joke, but we do know it affects so many people. It affects people you know, maybe family members, but it also affects celebrities. Amy Schumer, Ben Stiller, Daryl Hall, have been diagnosed and have been dealing with Lyme disease. You go to Shania Twain, Justin Bieber, and Avril Lavigne. And then it doesn't just affect singers and stars, it affects professional athletes like professional triathlete Angela Nath, Ella Dawn, women's NBA player, and then golf professional Jimmy Walker. So this is a disease that is all around us, and we hear about it almost on a daily basis. So it's of a concern. Now, like I said earlier, Lyme disease is not the only concern. Ticks transmit tons of diseases. It's Lyme that we hear about. This is a kind of a graph showing tick-borne diseases discovered since the early 1900s. And then into 2020, you can see an increase in our discovery of diseases in the last 20, 30 years. And that's because science has advanced, right? We're better at detecting diseases, finding it in humans, diagnosing it. Good, bad, not sure. We're gonna see the speed up. There's gonna be another tick-borne disease every year. I mean, don't quote me on that, but it's quickly approaching that. But when we think about tick-borne diseases in general, we have to understand. I teach my students to control a disease, you have to understand the biology of the disease. And tick-borne diseases are complex to a certain extent. We can break them down very simply in the ecological requirements of a tick-borne disease. Well, obviously, you need the tick. This is a tick. It's a very happy tick. You need the pathogen that causes the disease. And those pathogens can be viruses, they can be bacteria, they can be protozoan. They can be just salivary proteins that cause your body to have an immune reaction. So there's a host of different bacteria, viruses, or pathogens that can cause different diseases. And there's a lot of them. And then lastly, with many tick-borne diseases, we need an animal host and not a human per se. Humans are usually just kind of there and a bad kind of what we call a dead end host, meaning that we kind of walk into a situation and we're like, I wish I wasn't here, and we get a disease. That pathogen doesn't need us. If no humans were on Earth, things like Lyme disease would exist in ticks, the bacteria, and the host animal. So it would be happily living around and then spills over into humans. So a lot of tick-borne diseases require these non-human animals to perpetuate that disease in nature. And we'll understand why that's important later on when we're thinking about prevention and controlling disease. All right, so those are the ecological requirements for general tick-borne diseases. Now, I have my time right, it's about 7:08 p.m. here as well. And it's time for math. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but it's always good to learn about math. I have a first grader that's doing math. He's really good at it. And I want to just remind the audience that math is very important. And for us, there's a lot of smart scientists that come up with an equation for Lyme disease. So we have an equation. So the Lyme disease equation, and again, Lyme disease, I'm talking generally about tick-borne diseases, tick, pathogen, host. So with the Lyme disease equation, you have all these different hosts. You have, big animals, small animals, you have the ticks, you have the resources that are available to the animals, to be the hosts, to the resources for the ticks. And it gets very complex. They're differential equations, things I don't understand. This is just for the host, looking at host population dynamics. This is where we bring in infected versus non-infected host, because not all animals get or have Lyme disease. And then you have the ticks, which blows up this mathematical equation. There's a lot of letters, a lot of numbers, and I don't even know where to begin here. So it's very complex. That being said, I have broken this down for non-math majors into the Lyme disease equation. You can enter any tick-borne disease here. And I basically have highlighted this equation as the tick plus the host, the animal host, which we said were important, plus the pathogen. With Lyme disease, it is the spirochete Borrelia burgdorferi, plus the human. Remember, without us, there is no disease. There's just a pathogen circulating in nature. And you have to have all four of these to end up with disease. So complex equation, simple equation. I'll quiz you on this later on. We'll talk about this later. Remember Lyme disease equation. Now we're going to break apart tick-borne diseases by each of the parts of the equation. So let's talk about the tick. The tick is super interesting. This is where I've spent 17 years of my life studying, and I adore these little arachnids, more so than probably a normal person would. That being said, there are a lot of different ticks out there. This is the black-legged tick. This is the deer tick. This is Ixodes scapularis, the epitome of the tick that spreads Lyme disease. However, there are so many different ticks in North America, over 80 species. That being said, most do not feed on humans. So these are some of the more human. I should probably move this. Kathy, is this blocking the top of the screen? I apologize. There we go.
Yeah, and I can see it. It's my view is blocking and I can't move.
I think we're fixed now. All right. So now we have the different types of ticks. And what I showed this slide because they all look different. Now, maybe not to you, but very different to me. On the bottom, we have the larval stages, meaning the babies. These are laid from eggs. The babies then turn into the nymphs, which are kind of like the teens. Those nymphs then turn into adults within the next two stages, males and females. And then the female feeds and gets fed on blood and lays eggs. So there's three different life stages here and different engorgement statuses of females, but they all kind of look different. I'll have people come up to me and say, Dr. Leydet, I had the gray tick. I'm like, well, the gray tick doesn't exist. The gray tick is a fully fed tick of one of these subspecies. So that being said, you can get bit on by a lot of different ticks. I'll talk about some of the more common human biting ticks in Florida as well as on the East Coast throughout this presentation. All right, that leads us into that. So what ticks will you get bit by in Florida? Well, personal experience, black-legged tick. So this is the deer tick. This is the black-legged tick, Ixodes scapularis. They do live in Florida. You can find them in Florida, despite what people will tell you. And there's plenty of literature showing that they exist in Florida, and I'll show you some of that information. Second on the list, the American dog tick, Dermacentor variabilis. This is a tick that exists on the East Coast, east of the Mississippi. It will bite you. You will find it in Florida. We'll talk about some of the diseases it carries. Next two ticks, Lone Star tick. So this is a tick we don't deal with much up here in New York, except if you're on the island. If you're downstate on Long Island, the tick has started emerging there. This is a tick that's highly aggressive. The Lone Star tick, it's named because of the dot on the female's back. And this tick can spread certain diseases and even cause a red meat allergy. A very aggressive tick. I'll have a video of it later on. And then lastly, the Gulf Coast tick. I don't get to talk about a lot because we don't have the Gulf Coast tick up in Syracuse, New York, mainly because we're not on the Gulf Coast. The Gulf Coast tick I spend a lot of time studying in Louisiana and Florida. This is a tick that, well, started around the Gulf Coast and is spread. We do have populations in the coastal areas of New York right now. It's a very beautiful tick, a very large tick, and it does spread a specific disease called rickettsiosis, or Rickettsia parkeri, also known as tidewater spotted fever, which is funny because I'm from the Tidewater area of Virginia, and that's where the disease was named after. It infected a postal worker in Newport News, Virginia. All right. Florida has plenty of tick habitat. I always talk about New York, but I've spent enough time in Florida to know that you can collect the tick many places you go. And I pulled this data from a 2019 paper showing modeled habitat. And this is 3 different tick species. The screens, well, all the way over, I got laser pointer, all the way over here. You have the black-legged tick, the tick that causes Lyme disease. This is the predicted distribution, the habitat distribution. This is not set in stone. I'll show you some data in a little bit that shows that the tick is more widely distributed than this. But you can see the real good habitats for the black-legged tick are in central to northeast New York, as well as some northeastern Florida. I apologize. As well as some areas of the Panhandle down here in the Chapalaya Basin and those areas. In the middle, you have the Lone Star tick, which is the tick that causes red meat allergy. Again, is spread throughout New York. And I would say in y'all's area, you will have some of these tick species. You've probably been bitten by some of these tick species. All 3 of them exist in your area. And then lastly, we have dermacenter. The American dog tick has a more diffuse distribution. And then I don't have the data from the Gulf Coast tick because no one's done that yet. I would have pulled it up, but that is more diffuse, especially in y'all's area. I'm sure you have the Gulf Coast tick down in the Tampa proper. But going back to where we know black-legged ticks, the tick that spread Lyme disease, exists, this is a map from 1996 showing the counties that have a reproducing population. So you can see in 1996, it was kind of limited. The yellow area is the predicted distribution, kind of going back to those Florida maps where there's habitat. We just haven't detected them there yet. They're probably there. And what I want you to see from here is that the predicted distribution of the black-legged tick is kind of everywhere. So some of these really focal spatial maps don't really do a good job. And more importantly, in 2022, you can see down here in Florida is that the black-legged tick is pretty much established in every county in Florida, at least in certain areas. So in county level establishment, you could have one forest that has plenty of ticks, and that would be an established county. But that means that tick can get through its life cycle and propagate in your area, and you'll kind of see what I mean when I talk about the life cycle of the tick here in a little bit. All right, so let's talk about the tick and what it does. The biology of the tick is so fascinating. So ticks look for blood. You'll see later that ticks feed on blood like mosquitoes do. I'm sure we know that. But how do they find blood? Well, they do 2 different methods of finding a blood meal. One is what we call an ambush style method, and this is a female tick that has climbed up a piece of grass. It could be a twig, it could be a piece of harder grass, wet grass. It could be anything. It climbs up it and it basically puts out its front legs, and it looks for a warm-blooded animal to pass by and to grab onto to have a blood meal. So it's kind of an ambush, sit and wait. The other type of tick is the hunter tick, and this is a Lone Star tick. I talked about that earlier. This is a tick that actually doesn't sit and wait. It actually senses you pass by or an animal pass by, and it runs after you. It can run about 3 meters, so 15 feet, to chase you down, to climb up your leg, and then feed on you. So more aggressive. That's why we call them assassins. But what are they looking for? Well, a host, blood, right? But you don't see blood. You don't smell blood. So there's other things that cue a tick into a warm-blooded animal is here, near, or is passing. And those are things like odors and CO2 that we off-gas as we move, as we breathe. Certain animals have different breaths. Ammonia, we off-gas butyric and lactic acid based on our muscle movements. I like to show this dog because I think dogs are cute. Obviously dog breath. I show the dead deer. Dead deer are not cute. Well, I would say in New York State, maybe people do like dead deer. But we do know that some tick species actually seek out dead animals, not for a blood meal, but to wait for scavengers to come by. So things like coyotes, panthers, bobcats, depending on where you are in the country. the tick will wait for a warm-blooded scavenger to approach that deer and then attach to that to that scavenger. Heat's a big thing. Obviously, warm-blooded animals look very different on their background of plants, which are cold. So I would say this is what ticks would see. Most ticks don't have eyes, so they're not actually seeing infrared. But they are sensing this in a sense. They can see radiant heat from a mammal. Vibrations, so they can sense ticks can sense vibrations. And I always say I can't find a picture of a deer making a vibration. Like I have an elephant here. It's probably justified. Ticks don't, deer are not that heavy. But even elephants have their own tick. So going back to the idea, there's a lot of ticks out there you'll never see. This is an elephant tick. You'll never see that unless you're an elephant or hunting elephants. And I'm sure many of us are not elephants, and most of us are not hunting elephants. So just there's a lot of ticks out there we don't know that are out there or that are hanging out in animals we don't see. Sounds. So not only can they see or feel, ticks can sense sounds. Certain tick species actually respond to host feeding, like the chewing of grass on a cattle or the barking of a dog. And then lastly, a really strong attractant is our tick pheromones. These are like colognes or perfumes that ticks emit. This is a picture of an aggregation of baby ticks. And basically one tick goes up and says, hey, I'm looking for a meal. Everybody come up and join. And then all his brothers and sisters come up and join. And this can happen on a host where a male would get on and say, look, I have a host. It's a great blood meal. I need a female to have babies. And they'll release a certain pheromone to attract other biological sexes or other ticks of the same species. Life cycle is complex. It's a multiple life stages. So free living, there's the female or the adult. The adult female lays eggs. The adult males just mate and die. So females are there to lay eggs. Depending on the species, they can lay between 3,000 to 10,000 baby eggs, which is not ideal. Those babies hatch as larvae. If you're into Jeopardy, ticks are arachnids. They're not insects. Insects have 6 legs. Arachnids, like spiders, have 8 legs. If you're astute here, you can see the larvae have 6 legs. That is the stage of arachnid that has 6 legs. They will grow 8 legs when they become nymphs. Importantly, we'll discuss later that larvae are not infected with Lyme disease. Most tick-borne diseases are not transmitted from an infected female to their babies, but some are. So that's complicates certain situations. After the larval stage, the nymphs emerge. Nymphs are 8-legged, like I said. Importantly, again, for your Jeopardy fans out there, I don't think I've ever seen a tick question on Jeopardy. But nymphs and larvae, we can't determine a sex based on just visualization. So we can't determine if it's male or female, meaning they're not sexually dimorphic until they become adults. And for the black-legged ticks and most tick species, we can determine the sex based on visual characteristics. In the case of the deer tick, you can see the males have this dark back that extends all the way to their butt. These are not scientific terms. The females have a dark back that extends halfway down their back. That orange-colored area is the area that actually expands during the blood meal, so it gives them area to expand. Males don't take blood meals, so they don't need that orange area to expand. So you can determine sexes when they get to adults. All right, I mentioned earlier ticks feed on blood. That means they're hematophagous. This is a good term. The feeding on blood, I like to put up count here because he doesn't feed on blood, but he feeds on numbers. However, when you look at the way ticks feed on blood, it's very interesting. Unlike mosquitoes that kind of come in and bite and go, ticks have to stay attached for 2 to 7 to 10 days. So they have to go unnoticed. And when ticks bite, they find a nice secret place to hide. That's why tick checks are so important. We'll talk about those later. But basically, the ticks insert their mouth parts, similar to a mosquito, except unlike a mosquito has more of a needle-like mouth part, a really skinny, straight needle. Ticks have a fatter mouth part that has barbed teeth that actually help it stick into the skin to keep it there for 2 to 10 days, depending on the life stage. Last thing they do is they actually go in and they actually use their these appendages cause chelicerae. They're like scissors that kind of cut in, and they insert that mouth parts that have these barbed back ends. And once they're inserted, they'll actually, most ticks will release a cement that actually cements them onto your skin to really keep them attached. Now, the whole time they're doing this, they're releasing anesthetics and other things so you don't feel them bite, so you don't detect them. Now, some people are more sensitive than others and they will feel, some won't. They won't recall a tick bite. That's really important. It's one of the strategies to biting. A lot of us will feel a mosquito bite because mosquitoes spend less time releasing these antiseptics because they just want to bite and go. Ticks need to bite and hide. All right, when we're thinking about disease in ticks, now again, there's a lot of different tick-borne diseases, and for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to highlight Lyme disease because it's the most common disease. But just so you know, the biology of the diseases can differ, and I could give multiple presentations on all different diseases. But generally, we'll talk about Lyme disease when we think about disease and how it goes through the tick life cycle. So going back to the life cycle of the tick, we have the adult female here that lays 3,000 babies that are not infected. Good for us with Lyme disease. Those babies then take blood meals. As a larval blood meal, they feed on small animals like mice. They turn into nymphs, and then the nymphs feed on animals, small to larger animals, and turn into adults with the blood meal in between. So they have a very limited amount of blood meals. Mosquitoes can take multiple blood meals. Ticks take very few, 2. Unless you're a female, you take a third and you have babies. When we think about disease, if an adult female is infected with Lyme disease, remember those babies are not infected. So those babies have to feed, to become infected, have to feed on an infected animal on their first blood meal. That's depicted by this thermometer here. And then those babies will turn into nymphs and they will be infected. Those nymphs can then transmit the bacteria, the Lyme disease bacteria, to other animals, to humans, to whomever. If they feed on an uninfected animal, it's really interesting because they're still infected. So once a tick gets the Lyme disease bacteria, they're infected until they die. And that's unlike other circumstances. That's what we call transstadial transmission. What's important is that with that situation is that you can imagine uninfected baby ticks can feed on an animal that doesn't have Lyme disease. And then they would then not have Lyme disease. But because they take a second blood meal, the nymphs have a second chance to pick up an infection and then be infected as adults. So often when we're testing ticks, we see twice the amount of infection in adults than we see in the nymphs. And that makes sense because they've had twice as many chances at blood meals. All right, I haven't brought in deer. People like to talk about deer. Where do deer play a role here? Deer actually do not get Lyme disease. It's a good thing for them because they run a lot. They don't want arthritis. They live with ticks. Evolutionary strategy. But they feed a lot of ticks. And most importantly for Lyme disease is that the adult tick, the ticks right here, especially the adult female that needs a blood meal for eggs, they don't feed on small animals like mice or squirrels. You'll never find them on a small animal. I mean, you have to like convince them to feed on a small animal in the lab. So they need those larger animals to lay eggs. Now, those eggs are uninfected. The deer's uninfected. The deer is only there to perpetuate the babies. So I tell people, you can have a yard full of deer and ticks. As long as you don't have mice and other small animals, just deer and ticks, you'll have plenty of ticks, plenty of deer, and 0 Lyme disease. You need those smaller animals to perpetuate the diversity of those disease pathogens in nature. So deer really get a bad rap. I mean, deer are bad. They're overcrowded, but they get a bad rap when it comes to Lyme disease. They're not the only problem. I got to put this in here because this really shows the changes we've seen in Lyme disease over the last 20, 30 years. And I know it's New York, but I promise I have some Florida data coming up. But what you can see, I like to put this out here, is areas of downstate New York, which are historically considered endemic for Lyme disease, have really seen a smoothing off of the number of cases, or even a decrease in the number of cases, as indicated by these green numbers. Whereas areas in Western and Northern and Central New York, Southern New York, have seen a precipitous increase in cases, especially after the year 2006, 2010, that 5-year period, we really saw a change. And I'm going to talk about what that means here in a little bit and how that relates to maybe what you're dealing with or will deal with in Florida or New York if you live there, or other states if you go back and live there. So when we look at Florida, there are plenty of tick-borne diseases in Florida, a host of them. I have them listed here. There's probably more. But again, I'll talk about most of the diseases in the context of Lyme disease, and the prevention strategies are very similar. When we talk about Florida, I like to bring up my experiences in Florida because I did spend a few years of my life down there. I learned to surf barrels down there, so that was really important in my life as a surfer. I also met my mentor that brought me into tick-borne diseases. I literally had no interest in tick-borne diseases prior to coming to University of North Florida. There I met Carrie Clark, and I remember we started studying diseases. I'll tell my story. I was sitting in his office one day, and this undergraduate student walks in, and she shows us her arm, and she's got this bullseye rash on her arm, and we're like, "Wow, what happened?" And she's like, "We were at a field trip over in the Panhandle near Tallahassee at a state forest. We all got ticks, and I got sick. And my doctor said there's no Lyme disease here, and we were like, you need to find a new doctor." And because this was the rash that she appeared with, this is the rash from that female. It was published in this paper here as a case report. The next week after she came in, Carrie and I went over to the same state forest, collected black-legged ticks, tested those ticks. They were positive for Lyme disease with the exact same DNA sequence as what was tested in this young woman. So again, highlighting the fact that even, oh man, it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this was a problem that was unrealized in Florida as well as other places around the United States. Luckily, she got treated and she was better. And we got a publication out of it, which is a good thing. That being said, I tried to pull some data out of Florida. The medical data reporting system is not very good in the state. You'll see that here later on. I did the best I could, pulling from state and federal databases. But we were looking at reported tick-borne illness in Florida through reported disease statistics. You can see there are different tick-borne diseases. Now, this is anaplasmosis, a tick-borne disease. What I want you to take from this is that cases are going up. I'll show you some data specific to the Tampa Bay area here in a little bit, but this is Florida statewide data. So cases are going up with anaplasmosis. When I put in babesiosis and other tick-borne diseases, this is additive. So this map here shows the total number would be 75 cases with 40 of them made up by anaplasma, the rest being babesia. So it's kind of adding on top to the total cases. So we've got another tick-borne disease that's reported. When we add in ehrlichiosis, another tick-borne disease, we do see it completely increasing. Interestingly enough, I teach epidemiology, and part of my class, we look for patterns. And you can see this really interesting pattern in 2020, this huge decrease in reported tick-borne diseases, likely due to the lockdown and people not going to the doctors. We did see this across the country, decreases in reported diseases, especially outdoor-associated reported diseases. We look at rickettsiosis, another disease that needs to be concerned. Again, mimics the rest of them. They're increasing. And we'll talk about why that may be. And then lastly, the disease that causes the most tick-borne diseases in humans, Lyme disease. Lyme disease is the most common tick-borne disease in Florida. Like other tick-borne diseases, it is on the rise, which is a common trend. Now, when we look at the counties surrounding Tampa, and this is a 6-county area, I believe the Tampa regional, top of my head, Citrus, Hillsborough, Pasco, Saratoga, I can't get them all. But that kind of area, you can kind of see that area around. I pulled the data for the same diseases moving forward. And what you're going to see is on the top, the total Florida cases. And you'll notice on the bottom is that the Tampa area accounts for about 33% of all tick-borne diseases in Florida. You'll notice the diseases have the same similar trends. They're increasing. You'll see on this graph, Lyme disease bottoms out in 2016. That's because there is no data from the state of Florida reported to the CDC or easily accessible on their website For county level data, I do have the statewide data up here. They don't break it down by county anymore. But if you take that idea that the Tampa area is responsible for 33% of all cases, you can extrapolate this to look like this. So again, Lyme disease is continuing to increase, and the area on Tampa is reported for tick-borne disease is about 33% of all Florida cases. And again, that's likely underreported. All right, why is that important? Well, Canadian snowbirds. Some of these cases are imported. People bring Lyme disease from New York or other Northeast states down to Tampa, down to other states. Now, not all cases. From what I saw, at least in the 2020 data, they estimated half of Lyme cases were imported. The other diseases, it's a little less known. But we do have to think about that when we're thinking about disease, is that because of the amount of people traveling, there are importation of disease. However, we know there is transmission of disease within the state of Florida because there are cases being obtained within the state. Now, why do we see the increase in tick-borne diseases not only in Florida, but around the globe, New York especially? Couple things. One is this graph right here. Remember how I said deer are so important for the adults in the laying of the eggs? Well, prior to the 1900s, colonizers, the increase in population, the United States was almost hunted clean of deer, all deer species. And you can see this graph here. The deer population was almost wiped out. And that does a really good job of controlling ticks. However, conservationists noted that deer are really important in our ecosystem and decided that, well, we should probably bring them back and protect some of them. And that's a good thing. And so deer have rebounded under certain conservation efforts. That has led to more blood meal opportunities for adults and more eggs, so more ticks. On top of that, around the same time during colonization, the forested areas of the eastern United States were almost eliminated due to buildings, due to fuel. And in the early 1900s, again, conservationists realized not a good thing. We need forests. And so they brought back forest, which I would argue is a very good thing. Green spaces are great. However, those forests are not the virgin forests that were around prior to the 1800s. There are very few virgin large forests left in the United States. What it has resulted is these fragmented forest habitats. And that fragmentation is very important when we talk about disease and tick-borne diseases. And that's because these fragmented habitats introduce different variables when we're talking about disease and disease ecology. And one of those is this idea of where humans encounter forest. So you'll learn later that ticks live in forested areas. You know, they don't live in parking lots. The animals they need are in those areas, wild areas. I say forest. Forest can differ. But the bringing back of these fragmented forest types have increased what we call edge habitat. So in a virgin forest, we have this forest surrounded by an edge, and that edge is measurable. The same amount of forest can be fragmented, but because it's fragmented, that edge increases. So the length of edge, the measurable edge increases. And why does that matter? Well, it's because humans live on the edge of forest. Most humans don't live in the middle of forest. We live on the edge. So the more edge of forest available, the more interactions between humans and forested habitats or wild habitats where humans encounter ticks. So we're supporting this kind of conflict. The other thing that fragmented versus virgin habitat does is it changes the animal community dynamics. So in a virgin forest, we have this really harmonious animal community. There's large herbivores, there's large predators, there's small omnivores, herbivores being plant eaters like deer, predators being like wolves and bobcats and bears, smaller predators like foxes, and then even smaller animals like mice and shrews and chipmunks. When habitat is fragmented, we lose this heterogeneous community, and we get these really peri-urban or domesticated wild animals, the mice that live in your house, that come in and out of your house, the deer that eat your plants, the deer that are always in your yard. That's what we get. We don't get bear lurking around often. Kathy will say they have bear in Old Forge. They do. We don't get wolves. Those have been extirpated. There's still some panthers roaming around. But we're losing these organisms that don't do well around humans, and we're gaining the ones that do well. Those are mice and deer, and that is perfect for Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases. All right, last thing I do want to talk about, because this has actually really precipitated the spread of ticks and their diseases, is this. And this is a heat map. I usually when in person, I ask, do you know what this is? There's zones. Zone 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If you're a gardener, which I know some of you are, if not all of you are, this is a garden zone map. And you can basically take a garden zone map and say, when do I bring my tomatoes from inside to outside here in upstate New York? When do I plant my flowers where I live? Now, what's really important is to know that that map has been changed just recently. Just last year, that map, or this year, the map was changed. And you can see here that especially in areas on the extremes here in New York and down in Florida, you've had the expansion of certain zones. So zone 10 has moved up. Zone 7, zone 6 has moved up into upstate New York. And you're like, well, who cares? It just changes when I plant my tomato plant. That's not the only thing we care about, and I'll talk about that later. Yes, we care about our fruits. I like to show this in New York because in New York, we don't have coconut trees, banana trees, or orange trees. Now, you guys have that down in Florida, no doubt, but we can't grow them in New York. And there's a reason we cannot grow them up here. The reason is because we don't have the growing season for these plants. And I really like to talk about ticks in the context of plants because ticks have a very complex life cycle. I'm not going to go over the life cycle. It's very complex. Different species, different life cycles. But generally, it's between 1 to 2 years a tick lives. And between that 1 to 2 years, that tick has to make it from an egg to a larva to a nymph to an adult, find a blood meal, and then lay eggs. And the majority of that time, they are not hanging out on a mouse, just kind of riding around. They're actually dropped off in nature, exposed to the elements, just like a plant, a tomato seed, an orange seed. They like to live in the under the soil because it's moist, it's humid. So in my mind, they're a seed. Some people call them seed ticks. So think of them as seeds. To get from a seed to a fruit, not a fruit I like to eat, but a fruit indeed, it takes time, it takes growing conditions, and it takes the right conditions. And I think with global climate change, we're seeing those conditions change, just like we're seeing growing degrees change. And then one day I may be able to put a orange tree up here in Syracuse, New York. I will not hold my breath though. All right. So where do they live? Well, depends on the tick. There's 80 types of ticks. I'm going to talk generally, but know that ticks can pretty much live anywhere for a certain amount of time, even in your house for a certain amount of time until they die because they dry out. But generally, we find ticks in nature, harbored from hot weather, from wind, from the sun. So here in upstate New York, even in Florida, you find areas where you have a broadleaf that has fallen to the ground, that is decaying. That environment is really good for ticks because they hide under that leaf litter. They retreat when it's too hot in the midday sun, and they come out to look for a blood meal when it's right. In a forest, when you're walking in a forest, obviously you can find ticks in the middle of a trail, but often ticks are here in the sides of the trails or in the middle of the forest, and we'll talk about why that is. That being said, I like to show this is that's the black-legged tick habitat. We're talking about other ticks like the American dog tick. That tick really likes the edge of fields. So in this situation, while I may expect to find black-legged ticks in the forest over here, I'm more likely to find the dog tick on the edge where the forest meets the field. And that's just because that's what they like. The Gulf Coast tick actually likes sand dune-esque areas. Not just sand dunes, but has to have some grass and some trees. but you can find that tick in those areas, Lone Star tick as well. And you know, I grew up in the Outer Banks. I'll find the Lone Star tick on the dunes in the Outer Banks. If I go back to the bay where there's some cover, some small oak cover, I'll find the deer tick. So you're not safe anywhere. Ticks survive, like I said, for about 2 years. I put this in here because they're really hardy organisms. Here in upstate New York, I get a lot of talk about the winter. Well, what happens in the winter? It's snowed, it's really cold. Well, in the winter, the ticks actually retreat to what I call tick igloos. They actually live under that decaying leaf litter. And on top of it is that snowpack, just like an igloo is. An igloo can stay warm inside because of the ice that forms. Same thing for ticks. They stay under the snowpack. In the winter, in cold, in weather that's not ideal for activity, ticks will go into an hibernation. They'll save energy and they'll wait for the conditions to be right to come out to find a blood meal. That being said, you won't find ticks in complete snowpack, but as soon as the snow melts, you'll find ticks. Now, ticks feed on a lot of different types of hosts, and that's really important when you talk about tick-borne diseases. Remember, deer do not carry Lyme disease. They can carry other diseases. The black-legged ticks feed on a whole different types of hosts. This is actually a song sparrow with ticks on it from my yard. You can see about 36 ticks on this song sparrow. That being said, not all hosts get infected at the same rate. Like humans are susceptible to infection, so are different hosts. Now, again, Lyme disease, mice are really competent at being great hosts for ticks and disease. That's the red number here. Deer and raccoons, not so much. That's the green number. So thinking about your host community affects determines your risk of Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases. And just to kind of put that point home, don't pay attention to this. Look at the colors. Depending on where you are in the world, the different colors show what the ticks are feeding on, who's infecting the ticks, and what they're infected with. And the big idea is here is depending on where you are, the colors are all different. So your backyard to your neighbor's backyard to the next county's backyard could be very different depending on the environmental structure. Now, that being said, that can affect disease risk. I like to put this graph up because we know that small animals are so important that predators control small animals. And we know from studies in the Northeast that predator communities that are very natural, these kind of communities that are very diverse, reduce tick infection, lower nymphal infection rates, lower Lyme disease, lower Babesia, lower anaplasma. And then when we get into a disturbed environment where we have coyotes dominating, pushing out natural predators, we get higher tick infection, higher disease rates. Humans don't do good things with the environment. But we're here and we have to deal with it. We all have to deal with it. All right. Let's talk about humans. I talked about ticks. I've talked kind of about the pathogen. I've talked about the animals. Let's talk about humans, because without humans, we don't have disease. We don't care. So where do we encounter ticks? Well, I hate to say this, you encounter ticks where ticks are. And everybody's like, well, I don't like that, Dr. Leydet. And the good example I give is that when you're walking in a forest, let's say this is a trail you're walking on. Not a very good trail, but this is a trail. Where are you walking? You're walking on the trail. Where do you encounter ticks? On the trail. If you were walking in the middle of the forest, you would encounter ticks there. But most of us are not walking in the middle of the forest. So it's the areas where you're encountering the tick habitat. Tick habitats around you, you are just more frequenting certain areas. That being said, if you're not walking on a trail in your yard, you're encountering ticks on the edges of your yard where those tick habitats are. All right, let's talk about transmission. I'll talk in the context of Lyme disease. I like to show this because it shows my ability to not draw. It also shows how Lyme disease is transmitted. So here we have a tick that's feeding on an animal. And importantly, when an animal takes in a blood meal, the spirochetes, which are the bacteria for Lyme disease, sense that blood meal. They increase in numbers and they penetrate the stomach. They get into the circulatory system of the tick, which is kind of right here. They penetrate into the salivary glands of the tick and then deposit into the host. And that's important to know because many tick-borne diseases take time to transmit because of this process. Lyme disease is one of them. It takes roughly 24 hours to start this transmission process. That's just the biology behind it. Now, this can vary in certain situations, but that's why tick checks are so important. Get that tick off as soon as possible. You decrease the likelihood of transmission.
Brian, I'm checking in on time.
I
So
know.
time for questions.
I know I'm not gonna finish, Kathy. I'm gonna burn through it. Ready? We'll leave 10 minutes. Where we got? I'll burn through it. Bacteria is transmitted. It spreads in the body. It's in the skin for a very short period of time, causing that rash for some individuals, goes in the bloodstream, and then retreats to tissues. Not in the bloodstream anymore, so very hard to detect. General flu-like symptoms. You get sick. Most tick-borne diseases start with a general sickness. Not easy to know it's ticks. How do we know? We need to know we were in a tick area. We got sick in the summer. Flu-like illness in the summer. Tick-borne disease should be a red flag. In the United States, most people with Lyme disease present as arthritis if it's disseminated or left untreated. That being said, it can get to neurological issues, but most importantly, it can cause long-term illness. So diagnosis is hard. You'll hear this. I'm not a doctor, a real doctor, but diagnosis is terrible early on. I'll let Kathy share these slides with you. Kathy can share these slides with anybody, so you can see the data. But generally, it's bad early. It's better later when it comes to testing. Don't rely on an early test to be positive, to be diagnosed. Because you don't want to be a long hauler with Lyme. This has been called multiple different things. What we do know is that 10 to 20% of cases of individuals leave with certain symptoms, and they're dealing with symptoms for the rest of their life after getting Lyme disease. Prevention is important, Kathy. Give me 5 minutes.
Yes.
Okay. How do we solve the problem? Brings us back to math. This is that equation. We want no disease. So let's start taking apart this equation. Let's control the tick. How do we control the tick? Well, there's a couple different ways people have determined to do it. Tick tubes. They take these tubes, they throw them out. They have cotton that has a caricide in it, and the babies have this tick spray, and they don't get ticks, and this is great, and it's going to solve the world's problems, except that ticks feed on all different types of animals, not just mice, birds, deer, chipmunks, fox, shrew. Do not use cotton in toilet paper tubes. What about deer? Let's get rid of deer. Let's treat deer. There's these really cool 4-poster stations that have these paint rollers that roll that acaricide, that insecticide on the ears that kill the ticks. That's great, but they're super expensive, cost about $15,000 to run these for a year, and there's a lot of deer out there. What about lawn sprays? Lawn sprays work. There's commercial and there's do-it-yourself. Do not spray your lawn with your dog in it. Lawn sprays are great. The problem is that many of them work really well. They work really well because they were designed and manufactured to work well. So people are a little less apt to put that on their yard. They have off-target effects, meaning they affect other organisms. They may require specialized equipment. Some of the safer ones require more applications. They degrade faster. And then some of them are aquatic to the toxic environment. All right, take the host away. Syracuse had tried killing deer. We don't kill enough deer. It's not going to happen. Just can't happen. You can't kill enough deer. You got to kill all of them. What about the bacteria that causes the disease or the virus? There's an edible mouse Lyme vaccine out there. There's also this idea of releasing genetically modified mice in Nantucket. But again, you go back to the idea that mice are not the only host. So that's only curbing part of the problem. All right. We can't do the tick. We can't do the host. We can't do the pathogen. Guess we got to get rid of humans. That would solve a lot of problems, right? It can't be done, but hypothetically, we can take humans out of the equation. Vaccination, taking humans out of the equation. If we don't get the disease, then we don't care about it, right? There was a vaccine called Lymerix. It was pulled from the market in 2002 due to bad press, due to bad sales. That vaccine has now been revamped. It's called VLA15 by Valneva. They are partnering with Pfizer to release a vaccine. It's in phase 3 trials, probably 3 to 5 years out. It's really cool. It's got a really cool mode of action. I want to show this. So normal vaccines work by vaccinating an individual and we producing antibodies. And then when we're infected with a virus or a bacteria, the antibodies attack that bacteria and clear it. Now, the Lyme disease vaccine is really interesting because it uses the biology of the bacteria to attack it. So we have a vaccine, we develop antibodies. the tick feeds on us, and those antibodies actually enter the tick and kill the bacteria in the tick because it takes time for that bacteria to transmit. So it's a really cool mechanism that this vaccine does, and it seems to be very effective. All right. The other way to take humans out of the equation is through prevention. And I'm going to end it here really fast, Kat. This is my end all be all. We all brush our teeth. We wear sunscreen or put it on our children or grandkids. And then ultimately we wear seatbelts. Now I can say that I wasn't the best at wearing seatbelts when I was a kid, but my kid yells at me if I don't put a seatbelt on when I get in the car. And this is to prevent a motor vehicle accident, injuries to motor vehicle accidents. So it's public health and action to prevent disease. How do we do this for Lyme disease? Well, a couple ways. Proper clothing, tucking pants into your socks, ticks attached to your lower extremities, and they crawl up. So if you find a tick in your hair, it is crawled all the way up to your head. If you tuck your pants into your socks, tuck your shirt into your pants, that tick has to crawl on the outside of your clothes to get to your head. You're more likely to find it than it crawling under your pants. Acaricides and repellents. So repellents repel ticks. They keep them from feeding on you. Those are DEET-based, at least 20%. Acaricides kill ticks. Permethrin. Spray on your clothes. You can buy clothes that are impregnated with permethrin. Have a website here. You can find the right thing for you. Please follow directions when you're applying these. Tick checks. Going back to the biology. Takes 24 hours to transmit. If we're outside, we come inside. We look for ticks in the areas, under armpits, groin, everywhere. Know your freckles. Know your grandkids, your children's freckles. Take your clothes, throw them in a dryer. Let those ticks die in a dryer. Hang the clothes out. Around the house, what can you do? Well, you can make tick no-go zones. Basically, highlighting areas that are tick habitat by making barriers. So if your grandkid or your child walks out past a mulch layer or a stone wall, they know they're in a tick habitat. They know they need to be aware of checking for ticks. Gardeners, deer-resistant plants. They do a good job. There's a bunch out there. Plant native deer-resistant plants. You can look those up as far as your area in Florida. If you have a tick, please grab it at the base of the skin and remove the tick. There are tick testing available. There's multiple agencies that'll do tick testing. Save that tick, put it in a Ziploc bag, take it to your doctor if you get sick. That's part of the evidence that you were bitten by a tick to help your doctor diagnose a disease. You can visit the CNY Lyme Alliance. They have some really good vetted information that I vet personally. Treatment, obviously recognition of flu-like symptoms really early on. Your doctor needs to be astute to that. Saving the tick is helpful, bringing that tick in with you. Doxycycline, other antibiotics are really easy for ticks are really easy to cure certain tick-borne diseases, especially diagnosed early on. And then lastly, I'm going to leave it with questions. Sorry, it went a little late. Zoom's a little longer. I'm usually pretty fast with this, but these are Lucas and Lena, and I'll take any questions. And I can stick around longer if we have other questions, Kathy. I have some time.
Thank you very much,
Yeah,
Brian.
thank you. I'll keep my slides up in case I gotta go back, I assume.
Yes, you can leave them up.
And I mean, you have Lena dancing, so.
Also on the table, the Global Lyme Alliance did a listing of all the physicians, clinics, and providers in Florida that treat Lyme disease. You're going to be surprised how many people are working in the area. But with that, questions for Brian? Linda. Brian, I don't know if you can hear the question, so I'll repeat them. Are there any plants that you can plant in your yard? I believe your website has a list of plants on.
So there are a bunch. Now, I'm at SUNY ESF, we're environmental college. So I would say you need to focus to native plants in your region. And because I don't live in the Tampa area, I can't tell you of the native plants that are deer resistant, but a lot of them are the fragrant plants, things like mints, citronellas. Some of the more fragrant plants out there are really resistant. But I would really implore you to look these up. The resources are available. And I don't know, Kathy, I'm able to find some and forward it to you so you can forward to your group down there. I know I have the New York ones, but I don't want you planting New York plants in Florida and vice versa.
Questions? In Massachusetts, where
Yeah, so yeah, that should be pretty easy. Northeastern plants that's a little more common to New York, but I can there are resources online. Just look up deer resistant plants in your region, and there are tons of resources for you, and those will keep them away just through fragrance.
The vaccine that you talked about, I actually got that initial vaccine that was pulled out in 2002. I don't know if I'm protected at this stage in my life, but I got it then, and I never had Lyme disease, and lived in an area in New Jersey where it was very incredible. You know, we have it for our dogs. We were just talking about that before. We have some Simparica for our pets. Are we getting closer to developing a disease? You know, I worked in medicine and I saw some of the worst cases of long-term, like you said, neurological, cardiac, Lyme disease that, you know, it's a disease that costs money, and are we getting any closer, you know, with the development of that?
Yeah, I got that, Kathy. So you're likely not protected anymore. The vaccine needs boosters. So just when new one comes out, go get it. And yes, the new one is coming. It's 3 to 5 years out probably. It's a similar almost identical to what you had received. But I like to tell people is that all that is the Lyme disease vaccine. Doesn't protect you against any of the other things these ticks are carrying. And we are way far away from protecting us from those other pathogens. So that I hate talking about, Kathy knows I hate talking about vaccines. I hate talking about treatment because I believe that prevention is the only way to get around this. And that's why I do talk about seatbelts, toothpaste, and sunscreen, or teaching your kid to swim, right? That's how you prevent serious events. Treatment and diagnostic is reactionary, and you never want to be there because, as you said, people deal with long-term symptoms even after getting treatment, and I would never wish that on my enemy, let alone a loved one. So yes, there is a vaccine coming for Lyme disease. Even if I would get the vaccine, I would still be very cautious and not think twice about seeking a doctor's treatment after getting bit, if that helps answer your question.
Brian, do you want to say anything about pets?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was talking about the pets. So yeah, pets are interesting creatures. I did my PhD out of vet school, and what I learned from vets is that humans are wimps compared to animals. So a lot of times animals can get infected and never have signs and symptoms. And a lot of vets won't even treat if there's no signs and symptoms, which makes sense because if you're not feeling bad, is it a disease? There are vaccines for your dogs. There are tick collars and tick products for your dogs and cats, and I would recommend using them as your vet feels necessary. The other thing you should do is pets can bring ticks in. The pets are tick magnets. So if you're walking your animals outside, remember I said you contact the ticks on the middle of the trail. Your dog is not in the middle of the trail, and they're contacting all the ticks on the side of the trail. So it's important to look at them when they come in and take the ticks off because they could bite you. But also just using the fipronil, the collars, the certain things, the vaccines to protect your pets and yourself is a very good strategy.
Yes, go ahead.
So I tried to take some notes, because this is so interesting. So the tick becomes the larva and it goes on the little animals. I don't understand why the deer, like, if the deers don't get it, why are they such a problem?
Right. So it's really cool. Like, so you can actually take the bacteria that causes Lyme disease in a test tube and put in deer blood or a component of deer blood, and it'll actually kill the bacteria in the tube. And that it's a complicated process. We can't do that with us. It would kill us as well. But the importance of the deer, remember, the adult tick. So I have collected 10 maybe 100,000 ticks off animals in nature. And you will never find an adult tick on a small animal like a mouse or a chipmunk. They just don't feed on them. Even when I worked in a laboratory and I was like, why don't they do, because it's just an observation, right? I said, let me try to make an adult tick feed on a mouse. So I had a mouse in a lab, I had an adult tick, and I put him in. I said, you got to be hungry, feed on that mouse. And it took forever until that tick was almost dead. And then it fed and it almost killed the mouse because it took so much blood. Mice have very little blood. So it doesn't happen in nature. So the adults need the larger animal. That deer is really important because without that deer, the adults don't have a blood meal and therefore will not lay eggs and not have babies and will end the life cycle of that tick. So that deer, that bobcat, that fox, that raccoon are really important, not for the disease per se, the actual disease itself, but for the adult to lay 3,000 babies and those babies to pick up disease from a small mouse. Does that clarify your question?
We don't have to be huge, but you can change the experience of the life cycle, now that you can do.
I missed that, Kathy.
I think you answered her question. Thank you.
Perfect. Great.
Brian, thank you so much. I
Yeah.
appreciate your being willing to share. You know so much, and the information available in Florida is substantially lacking. And
It's disappeared, Kathy.
yes, so thank you very much.
I'll provide you with these slides if you want, Kathy, and you can pass
Yeah.
them out. Yeah.
Could you do that, and I'll get them out to the members.
And then
Thank
if anybody has questions, feel free to forward them along. I'm a resource. You know that. I'm always willing to talk ticks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Enjoy the weather.